Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Nizar Hassan, joined as usual by Benjamin Red.
Hey.
In a very sweaty environment.
Oh, man.
And it's pretty unbearable.
Yeah, I'm almost soaked through with sweat already, and we haven't even started the podcast. The electricity is starting to get back to normal right now. However, we're not back to normal right now. And for instance, my power, I didn't have any generator or power for the past hour and a half. It just came back as we were starting. So Lebanon in the summer. We've got a lot to talk about. It's been a few weeks since we were last on the air, and a lot has happened since then. We're not going to go through everything this week, but we do want to go over a couple of news items, and then we want to get to the main topic today, which is Riad Salameh, the man of the hour, right?
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah, we've dug up some interesting things. I wouldn't say dug up because it's all right there, but in the course of our research, I think we found out some very interesting things that neither one of us knew beforehand. All right, very quickly to go through the news, we are seeing a major spike in coronavirus cases right now. As of Saturday, there were 1,854 active cases. Now, this is way above the normal number of active cases. If you'll remember, there were around 500 active cases on average in Lebanon from April through the first week of July, actually. But since then, the number has more than trebled. And so in the past week alone, we have seen 807 new cases. That was as of Saturday. We're recording this on Sunday afternoon. So we have not yet seen the numbers for today. Prior to July, a bad week would have been 150 new cases. So 800 new cases in the past week is quite a lot. And then also, just on Saturday alone, there were 175 new cases. That was a record. That was more than, what a bad week would have been a couple months ago. And the majority of the new cases also, crucially, are local. So, for example, of those 175 new cases that they discovered on Saturday, 144 of them were local. And so we are definitely in the community spread phase of things. Testing is still up, but the increase in detected cases isn't due just to more testing. There actually is a real spike in corona that we're looking at right now. And it's quite worrying because hospital capacity, there are really only, I've seen two figures for the number of ICU beds Lebanon has, somewhere around 260 and also 430, also with ventilators. This is a rather low number, but luckily right now we're much lower than that. There are 144 people in the hospital right now due to corona. 31 of them are in intensive care. Only 31, but we've got a capacity of at least like 260 or so. The problem is when this number increases, it might increase exponentially. And so the worry is that we could actually, even though the ICU capacity seems a lot larger than our current caseload for intensive cases, it actually could be overwhelmed quite quickly if we see a rapid increase in the number of hospitalizations and in the need for intensive care. Petra Khouri, an advisor to the Prime Minister, shared a slide from the Ministry of Public Health showing that the ICU capacity could be reached as early as August 14th. And Firas Abiad, who heads the COVID response at Rafik Hariri Governmental Hospital in Beirut, said, "I believe we are on the brink of losing control."
So basically, this is the second wave we were warned about, and it's happening in a quite dramatic way.
100%. Yeah. Very quickly want to note that this has also touched politicians. Jojo Ace, who is an MP for Zahle, for the Lebanese forces, came out the other day saying he has corona. Apparently, he got it from an official at the foreign ministry. And since then, he's also been meeting with seignorage, the head of the Lebanese forces, and Nabi Berri, the Speaker of Parliament, the head of the Amal movement. Immediately, Berri canceled parliamentary activity for Monday and Tuesday and urged MPs to get tested. Berri himself got tested. Al Jadid reported today that he tested negative, and seignorage, his press office, said that Jaja had tested negative as well. And we also expect new restrictions to be announced today, but we are not quite sure what those will be yet. Those will be announced this afternoon, after right now when we're recording, but before this is published at midnight.
Yeah, wear a mask. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Also, over the past few weeks, we have seen a very major push from the Maronite patriarch, Bashar al-Rai, in favor of neutrality for Lebanon in international affairs. And this is a call that's, it sort of echoes dissociation policy, stuff like that, that's been around in the political discourse for
Since
years.
1958.
Yeah. And it's agreed upon, like March 14th forces and Christian forces as well, are in favor of this generally. Even Gibran Bassil said he basically supported it. We are with neutrality, he said, that will help Lebanon maintain its unity and defend it from attacks from Israel. But he says that this also requires an internal consensus inside Lebanon. It requires a national dialogue. Otherwise, it's going to cause problems internally. And what he's referring to here quite clearly is opposition from Hezbollah and Amal, who believe that such neutrality would be applied to the Israeli-Arab conflict. Rai, for his part, says it would not lead to any sort of opening up to Israel or anything. But this is one of those things that it's this perennial discussion, that is Lebanon, part of the West, part of the East. Should we be neutral? How neutral, and in what respects? This is a conversation, like you say, that's been going on basically since Lebanon's independence.
Yeah, and the context for this push by Rai is basically that Lebanon is in a position today where forces allied with the Syrian regime and the Iranian regime, so basically the axis of resistance, whatever it's called, they are more powerful than their opponents who are more aligned with the West. And still, Lebanon needs the West quite desperately to get money, especially during this crisis, and in general for the survivability of its economy. So we're in this position where we have to be close to, or at least on good terms with everyone. And the other way would be literally like a catastrophe if you think about it from a political economy kind of point of view, right? If you just give up on their connections with the West, and no one is in that position anyway. But I think this push is specifically aimed at, ensuring that from now on, even if Hezbollah and Syria has a lot of leverage and Lebanese power in the Lebanese government, this doesn't mean that Lebanon kind of aligns with the Axis.
Yeah. Very quickly, the lira is still fluctuating. I do not know what the real value of the lira is right now. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, the dollar was 7,500 if you're selling dollars yesterday. My friend sold dollars for that much. So, and I bought something that was priced at 7,300. So I think shops are being able to buy some dollars around that rate, just over 7,000. But in other areas outside of Beirut, obviously the prices sometimes lags behind. When it's falling in Beirut, it stays, higher in other places. So, for example, in Saida, it would be around 8,000 or 8,500 in Shuf as well, etc.
Yeah, and this has just been fluctuating wildly, and I mean wildly, sort of between 7,500 and 9,000 or so lira to the US dollar over the past few weeks. It seems to me as though, people seem to be following these apps that have zero transparency. We don't know where they're actually getting their figures from. There is a lot of suspicion right now that some of these apps are basically pulling these numbers from like sort of a couple of big exchanges who are then able to manipulate the price based on the money they think that they can make. There's that concern. And then also, like you'll notice, I noticed a couple of weeks ago, after one of the fluctuations, the price had gone down below 9,000 pretty significantly. And then it started to reach back to 9,000. And right when it reached 9,000, I was on one of these Telegram groups where you buy and sell and everything. Right when it reached 9,000, you just saw a massive flood of people who had been holding onto their dollars who were like, I'm willing to sell at 9,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of me thinks that a part of the psychology is still at 9,000, or at least it was a couple of weeks ago. Now I don't really know where it is. I'm not entirely sure where it should be. And I really, really, really wonder about manipulation.
And we should always keep in mind two things here. First is that there are very different actors within the black market. You have the big shots who sell tens of thousands of dollars and buy tens of thousands of dollars, and you have the small actors, the emerging young people who just got into the business because it makes sense during this time, and they sell $300-400 or buy $300-400 at the time, and these get influenced by the apps and by the news so much, right? Because if you're not such an experienced exchange shop, you don't really know the dynamics. If you're not such a smart person in this business specifically, you might get involved in a dynamic that actually makes you buying dollars at higher prices whenever you see that there's a rise or whatever. So this is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is that we're witnessing quite a stable time, relatively speaking, for the dollar after it had been increasing by almost 500 liras a day or something like that. And this is a relatively stable time, but it's the time where most Lebanese diaspora members come to Lebanon. So Lebanese immigrants who work abroad usually come during July and August, or end of July is like, I think, the most the time of the year where we have most immigrants coming here, spending money, bringing dollars. And these days they brought more cash dollars than usual because they won't transfer them through the normal means. So this means that we were probably seeing a kind of a pause for the depreciation of the lira. By the end of the summer, there are a lot of predictions I just hear them every now and then by experts, etc., that by the end of the summer, the trajectory of depreciation will accelerate again, and the dollar might get to over 10,000 again and keep increasing.
Are there really that many expats coming visiting this summer, though?
I don't know the numbers, but now you have Eid al-Adha, and I mean, I know plenty of people who came in the last 2 weeks, so I think that's quite an anecdotal evidence.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we are still in the midst of, we may have hit pause, like you say, a little bit, but for a lot of people, no, that pause doesn't really mean a whole lot because the economy continues to deteriorate at really an unprecedented pace. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw this very sharply in the education sector with the American University of Beirut, their medical center, laying off some 850 people in one fell swoop.
Yeah, it was quite a tragic day, to be honest, and the scene itself was not nice at all. AUB seems to have called the military to be kind of supporting it on the day of the sacking of these people, of these workers. So the army was there, and as if it was ready to repress any attempts of fighting back by the workers. So it was a very kind of ugly manifestation of this alliance between employers and the military, at these sensitive moments of economic crisis against the workers' interests. But also a lot of reports about the way workers were told on that specific day that they were sacked was quite indignifying. It was a bit humiliating to some people had their accounts shut down, so they couldn't log onto their computers anymore. Other people were told by the department head by phone, like, sorry, this is your last day. Overall, it was quite a despicable way. And Fadl Khour, the head of AUB, the president, said we could have managed that week better, which is it's an understatement of really how bad AUB managed it and where it situated itself in the dynamic of social forces, between siding with the oppressors and siding with the oppressed or the workers.
Yeah, and this really is notable as well, just because AUB is insanely rich, right? And so you have this, they are in a very difficult financial time right now, but at the same time, it would be like Harvard laying off people in the middle of an economic crisis. That's sort of obviously AUB is not Harvard. Well, it's the Harvard of like West Beirut or something, right? But it's kind of like that. If like Harvard, this is super rich institution with all these endowments and everything, were to just lay off a bunch of people.
Yeah, not only a rich institution, also one that pays very high salaries to its top management. You have this managerial class in AUB that gets really large amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. And if you just look at the salaries of the workers who were sacked, as a lot of people on social media did on that day, if you look at their total salaries compared to the salaries of the top managerial class of one of them, the head of AUBMC or Fadl Khouri, etc., you find that AUBMC clearly just made the decision to cut the livelihood of hundreds of workers during the worst time for that, because they can't find other jobs in this market, instead of cutting some of the earnings of its managerial class, more or less. And these are really, really rich people that have a lot of benefits apart from the salary. So it's, in my opinion, it's totally unfair, and it's really despicable that AB took this choice, because it's ultimately a choice related to morals and to social justice, right? And they just are on the totally wrong side.
Yeah, and there have also been concerns voiced in the past couple of weeks about other institutions of higher education in the country as well. Obviously, this, continuing economic collapse is a high priority, or rhetorically a high priority, for a lot of higher ups, a lot of politicians, as well as the international community. And we saw the French foreign minister come to town this past week, Jean-Yves Le Drian. Did I say that relatively okay, Nizar? Do you want to say it?
No comment.
Okay, all right. He was in town this past week, and he said that progress was not encouraging. He said that serious, incredible measures still needed to happen, that they hadn't happened yet, and he pleaded once again, "Help us to help you," which is him repeating something that he had said in Paris a few weeks back. Now, nothing really came of this visit that we know of, other than France did offer some token support for, I believe, private French schools. And Le Drian also claimed that France is working on a comprehensive plan to help Lebanon through this crisis. He said that the IMF help was also essential, but the IMF talks are still stalled. And honestly, they don't look like they will come to fruition. Certainly not anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, part of this, I think, is France is sort of the prime mover still in Lebanon, at least amongst the Western powers. It would look, gauche for the United States to sort of like step in front, or for the UK, for instance, to step in front. There's a certain deference that they give to France, owing to its, imperial past and the mandate era here in Lebanon. But certainly France wants to, at very least, appear like they are doing everything that they can to help Lebanon right now, even though nothing's really happening.
Yeah.
We did have good news, however. There will be a forensic audit, after all. After Ghazi Wazni, the finance minister who is loyal to Nabi Berri, outlawed it, or said, no, it will not happen. They seem to have changed their minds. The government picked a firm named Alvarez and Marcel. Hezbollah and Amal ministers cast blank ballots in the cabinet meeting, saying that all the firms had some sort of connection to Israel. It is good, though, that we've gotten this far. For me, though, I still have a lot of questions. Most importantly, will this company get the documents that it needs and the access it needs in order to conduct a full, thorough audit? And then also, what's going to happen with the results? Are we going to get to see any of them as the public or not?
Yeah, to me, the big question is this a deal, or is this a real audit? And this is I don't know enough about the credibility of this specific company. Clearly, when you read about it, it's not like it's a company that is so specialized in the forensic audit specifically. It's more of a general company that works in corporate, turnarounds and reforms, etc. But they work on things they have a division called disputes and investigations, and they have worked on similar things in the past. But the question is not whether they have the skills to do it, is whether they will be allowed to do it, and whether they are going into this contract as a serious audit firm, because we can't have high trust of anyone who works with the central bank in Lebanon after what we've seen.
And speaking of the Central Bank of Lebanon and its governor, segueing slightly into our main topic, but we've got a couple of news items, though, about this.
Yeah, one big news item was a judge actually issuing a verdict to impose a protective freezing of some of the assets of Riad Salameh, central bank governor, based on a charge that Salameh had undermined the financial standing of the state. So it's not a big deal, right? And let's not make it into bigger than what it is. The assets first do not include the money he has in bank accounts. They include real estate properties, some personal possessions like furniture inside of this house he has in Rabi, and potentially his personal cars. But also Salameh can lift the freeze through bail. This is not a freezing that was imposed after a verdict. This is a protective freezing because there's a case against Salameh, and the first court session will be later this year in October. And this lawsuit that was filed by a bunch of activist lawyers is actually like the real story. That one is the one we need to keep a closer eye on, because the verdict in that case would be whether Salameh has mismanaged the state finances or not, and this would have much bigger repercussions than, confiscating his furniture.
Right. Also, Salameh made big news in the FT. Chloe Corniche had a great scoop, a really big scoop, that BDL, well, we know BDL, first off, has been sort of playing around with this other assets line on its balance sheet, right? And so it's become more and more obvious that this line, other assets, is an accounting balancing item, basically meaning it doesn't really exist. It's just there to make BDL seem like it's still afloat, because they've got a whole bunch of liabilities, a whole lot of money that BDL owes to like banks and stuff. Well, in order to balance their books, BDL needs something on their asset side to say, oh, well, we've got enough, we have enough assets to cover all of our liabilities. And this line, this other assets line, has been suspect for a very, very long time. And we got a little bit closer to understanding it with Chloe Corniche's piece this past week in the FT. Specifically, there is one part of that line that is supposedly from seignorage on financial stability, whose value the governor himself determines. However he determines it, that's the value. And this value, $6 billion.
And to explain it without jargon, this is future profits that will be made from the process of printing money. So they're counting these profits as assets, although they haven't been made yet. It's not profits of the past. It's estimating profits from printing money in the future, which is controversial in itself. But also, the number itself seems to be not based on any proper accounting mechanism. It's just a number that Riad Salameh decides as deemed appropriate by him.
Not according to some accounting standard, not according to any sort of IFRS or anything like that. No, this is just like, if he says it's worth this amount of money, it's worth that amount of money, which is fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And experts that Chloe interviewed in her piece said things like, this is too bizarre for words. Many of these assets are inventions. I've never heard that the governor can make up a number, etc. So if this is true, then Riad Salameh has basically faked numbers in order to pretend that BDL is not losing as much money as it did. Anyway, I guess with this whole story happening of, Riad Salameh being under scrutiny, the forensic audit, the issue with the boosting assets, the judge's verdict, etc., it's good to take a step back. And this is why I've tried to make this last part of the episode kind of a profile of Riad Salameh, right? To talk about who this man is and some sides of him that are not so talked about usually. Just the basics first. He's a 70-year-old man. He was born in 1950. His birthday was actually 10 days ago or so. It was on the 17th.
So that would be not Friday that just passed, but the Friday before that. Exactly. Happy birthday, Riad.
Happy birthday.
I'm sure he's lilistening.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, he comes from a family of businessmen. According to the publicly available information, his father had a hotel in Brumana. He went to this school called Collège Notre Dame of Jamhour, which suffers to a lot of AUB students, I would say, is known for sending French-speaking, obnoxious kids and very posh kids to AUB. Sorry, former colleagues. I'm just, I'm just repeating stereotypes that I've heard. It's not my opinion.
Really, it sounds like you had like a bad experience once.
Once? Anyway, Riyad graduated from Jamhour. He went to AUB where he studied economics, and then he worked for like 20 years at Merrill Lynch, big company that is a division of Bank of America, and it specialized in investment and wealth management. And he worked in the Beirut office and the Paris office of the company. In 1985, he became the vice president of the company. So he was a rising star in the field of managing investments.
A vice president, but yeah.
Yeah, obviously. So in 1993, having built a good reputation, working with a lot of businessmen, reportedly many rich Arab businessmen and wealthy people. He was contacted by Rafiq Hariri. According to the Lebanese Army magazine profile, which was a very, very favorable profile, it was basically just a piece praising Riad Salameh and calling him like literally the best man you've ever heard of.
A lot of those pieces out there.
A lot, incredible amounts of pieces praising Riad Salameh. We'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, this piece says that Hariri actually called up Salameh, Rafiq Hariri, late prime minister, called up Salameh and told him, would you manage some of my finances? Obviously, Hariri was a very rich guy, and he had known from probably his rich Arab friends that Salameh is a good guy to call for investments. He was very fascinated by him, and then he suggested him to be the next governor of the Lebanese Central Bank. And just one thing for context that I'd like to mention here is that, both Hariri and Salameh kind of grew in parallel to the growth of Arab capital in Gulf countries, right? Hariri was a guy who made all of his wealth, initial wealth in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, based on his connections with the royal family. Reportedly, Salameh also arose as a star of investment management by managing rich Arabs' money. So you can say the same about a lot of Lebanese politicians, right? Hassan Faris or Adnan Qassar or Mohammed Safadi, etc. A lot of Lebanese officials and politicians rose after the civil war, had shined as a new bourgeoisie that was really close to Arab Gulf capital.
So Salameh went from being one of Rafiq Hariri's personal bankers, basically, to coming to the central bank in August 1993. Now, what had happened when Hariri came to power was it had come on the back of this massive devaluation of the lira that had gone from something like 900 lira to the dollar in 1992 up to almost 3,000, right? This is where that 3,000 number gets bandied around. I've seen like 2,850 at least has been cited. But basically immediately after, they had the elections in 92, there was an agreement to bring in Rafiq Hariri as prime minister. And basically as soon as Hariri came in, that, the lira went back to almost what it was before. And it was as of the end of July, 1993, the lira was at 1729 to the dollar, not too far off of the 1500 that we know today. And so what actually surprised me in going back and looking at this is that I had thought that Riad Salameh was responsible for bringing the lira from like 2850 down to 1500. But then in looking at the timeline again in prep for this show, I realized, oh, no, by the time he got into office, the lira was already pretty close to 1500. And then it just, under his tenure from August 1993 until the lira was fixed, the peg was introduced at the end of 1997, we just saw the lira float down ever so gradually from that 1729 to the 1500 to 1515 band that we had for 20 years.
Yep.
And the other thing to note there is that a lot of people say that the devaluation that happened in 1992 that caused the downfall of the Omar Karami government and the Hariri to be ushered in a year later, that happened due to speculation from the banks. Just as there are reports that the exact same happened. It was bank speculation that had driven the devaluation in the early 80s and the one also in the late 80s and 87. And so this is a major problem. A lot of people were saying, well, it's the banks who are driving these kinds of things. But then weirdly, as soon as Hariri gets into office, this stops and Hariri himself finds a way to sort of bring the banks into the system, so it's no longer in their interests to mount these speculative attacks, because all of a sudden there was this new thing, government debt, that they were heavily invested in, and so they didn't want actually the value of the lira to go down as much.
Yeah, exactly. And Riad Salameh coming in was basically, he was Hariri's guy, but he was also someone from, the financial sector. He didn't have a public sector background. He had the private sector background. And after being appointed governor in 1993, he went on to have his term renewed 4 times after that. So that's why he's still governor today. His term was renewed in 1999, 2005, 2011, and 2017, right? And when different governments were in power, different political affiliations, it was not like only Hariri's people who were renewing for him. This was a diverse bunch of cabinets and political formations that brought him back to the same position. But throughout all of these years, the main credibility, source of credibility or legitimacy for Riad Salameh has been that he has been able to keep the lira stable, and meaning the exchange rate stable, right? And we're talking about many crises that Lebanon passed through all since 1993. We're talking about 2005, the assassination of Hariri. 2006, we had basically an Israeli aggression and the war. In 2008, like a mini civil war happened with the May 7 events, and the financial crisis happened worldwide. And Lebanon was one of the probably least impacted countries when you see the manifestations of this global financial crisis in the country. You notice that it's really negligible compared to other countries. And so Riad Salameh has accumulated throughout these years a lot of legitimacy as, the man who keeps it stable, the man who protects the lira, etc. And this has contributed to him having a very glorified image in public discourse, in media. He's been seen and portrayed as this hero technocrat, who saves us from crisis. And Hisham Safiyuddin, friend of the show, has made a good point, which is that Riad Salameh is basically his credibility and his popularity was in contrast to the stereotype of the Lebanese politician who is less competent, who are sectarian, etc. So he was like being the technocratic person, the person who has the skills to manage the sector is responsible of, etc., gave him more and more credibility as the politics and the political practice was decaying. And also because BDL was not only playing a passive role, just managing inflation and basic monetary policy. BDL was stepping in sometimes when it was quite unusual for a central bank to be stepping in.
Yeah, it was really interesting a few years back. I think it was around 2015 or 2016. You noticed that the Beirut Marathon, right? This big marathon that happens, big for Beirut at very least, big for Lebanon, big marathon that happens every year. It's usually sponsored by Bank. But weirdly, it was sponsored for a couple of years, I think, if memory serves right, by BDL, right? And at the time, I thought, oh, something must have gone terribly wrong with Blom and BDL is stepping in. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one who thought this. But, regardless, when there are big events that people go to and they see that BDL is a sponsor for that, well, first off, the central banks usually don't sponsor things like this. It's a very weird thing, keeping a marathon going or something like that. But from the public's point of view, you look around you see all of the other state institutions failing. You see private institutions not really stepping up. You see, economic hardship and stuff like that starting to mount. And BDL, this actually competent organization, seemingly, is stepping in and helping certain things survive that might not survive otherwise.
Exactly. And when you talk about housing, when you talk about startups and SMEs, small, medium enterprises, BDL was taking claiming a role that is usually that of the executive authority of the government. It was giving facilities to all of these different fields where it was basically as if there was no one to act but the central bank. And we should be fair here that, if governments had done a more proactive role, the central bank wouldn't be the economic policy maker in Lebanon. So it was basically like throwing a lot of things on the back of Riad Salameh throughout these years, deal with this, give facilities to this or that, subsidies to this or that,
right,
without having a solid plan from the executive authority or a parliament working effectively to monitor the budgets and push for certain lines and directions in the budget.
Right, because essentially the politicians couldn't agree on things. And so they just left it to Salameh to just sort of like generally, move into housing, help that out, move into tech startups, help them out, that sort of a thing.
Exactly. And because of how big of a role he's had, and because he's managed to keep the exchange rate stable until very recently, he's been acknowledged internationally by a lot of private entities as one of the notable central bankers globally. He's received plenty of awards and annotations, and he's been on so many lists, etc. So this also has, accumulated with all the other things to make Salameh sort of the man who is not doubted or criticized so much by Lebanese media at all, or Arab media. Like, we didn't used to see any critical coverage of Salameh by almost anyone until really quite recently, a couple of years back. I remember, right?
Yeah.
Like after we started the podcast, I remember like when things started to look like Lebanon is going into it's falling off the cliff financially soon. Then people started pointing out at Riad Salameh having been probably doing some wrong policies, etc. And because of all of these, he was at so many points. He was his name was thrown in very seriously as a potential candidate for president. You know, first of all, he's a Maronite man. Is then also he's had a very very high position. He has a lot of credibility. He has a lot of political connections, etc. And he's always portrayed as, you know, if politicians can't agree on a name, then get either the army commander or the central bank governor, because they represent the state rather than politicians and militias, etc. So this also was, I think, a factor.
Okay, so all of this was based, though, on this idea of Salameh because we didn't really know what was going on, right? Like there was. It's not like we were present in these meetings where Salameh was making decisions or doing anything. No, he was just like this bureaucrat, you know, this golden bureaucrat who just kept his head down and got the work done, which seemed really, really great. But we did get a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, when WikiLeaks released the U.S. State Department diplomatic cables, right? And there is a treasure trove of information in those, especially, I know probably a lot of people are not huge fans of Jeffrey Feltman, but I have to say his reports are quite detailed, quite precise, well written,
and entertaining,
and very entertaining.
Yeah, he was a very good like writer. He's just sarcastic sometimes.
Right, and usually what these things, these diplomatic cables are, is just like Feldman would have a meeting with some politician, and this politician would gossip some, tell him what's up, and then he would write up, you know, the details of that meeting. Right?
Exactly. So one of the meetings that has one of the greatest, I think, cables available was from a meeting with Jihad Azour, who is now the IMF regional chief. But back then he was a finance minister, and another minister called Sami Haddad, and another meeting with Mohammed Shattah, who was later assassinated. And
Shattah is also a former finance minister.
Yeah, exactly. And they are all within the future camp, more or less. And the meeting with Jihad Azour and Haddad, which Feltman writes about very descriptively, was after Rafiq Hariri had been assassinated, and President Lahoud's extended term was ending. Lahoud, for those who don't know, was a pro-Syrian regime president that had a major political conflict with Rafiq Hariri ahead of Hariri's assassination. Anyway, the meeting was basically a meeting where Haddad and Azour were telling Feltman, be careful of Riad Salameh. We shouldn't get Riad Salameh to be president, because Riad Salameh's name was going around back then. And they said that he was actually the favorite candidate of the Syrian regime and of Hezbollah. And that's why, you know, the Americans should be wary of allowing him to become president. And it was a very serious candidacy by then, if not candidacy, but like it was a very serious potential, according to Feltman. But also in another paragraph, another section, Feltman writes about how Salameh, according to reports that he got, was going to Europe and then disappearing for a few hours or one day, and meanwhile allegedly going to Damascus to meet with the Syrian regime officials, because he didn't want to go straight from Lebanon, because that would be tracked by the Americans and everyone else. So what Feltman was saying is that Riad Salameh seems to be on very good terms with the Syrian regime, and he's been meeting with them frequently, and that Hezbollah people also speak of him highly, according to, you know, the UN ambassador, special coordinator in Lebanon back then. So the pro-Senura, because Senura was like a leader after Rafiq Hariri's assassination, obviously he was prime minister, etc. So Senura's people were very wary of bringing in Salameh, specifically because Salameh represented this the guy who potentially would flip after becoming president and become like a Syrian regime tool in Lebanon.
And the Americans were also concerned, according to these cables, just based on Salameh's own personal relationships, and they were afraid that they could be used against him by the Syrian regime.
Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, you can read the WikiLeaks files for more info. It's really a fun read, so I would recommend it. But all of this, like Salameh being, you know, the Syrian regime and Hezbollah's guy, is very weird to hear now. It's very surprising, because what we know and what you hear of today is that Salameh is the guy that's always being targeted by Hezbollah and all of this media, international and Arab mostly, and local, were running these headlines saying Hezbollah wants to get rid of Salameh, etc. during the last few months of protests and Thawra time.
Right. Salameh was brought in by Rafiq Hariri. Now he's Saad's guy. There's no daylight. But, well, no. Clearly, the history does not bear this theory out.
Definitely not. I mean, if you look at the history, he's the establishment guy. He's not March 14. He's not Hariri's guy specifically only. Salameh's last term renewal happened in 2017 under Aoun presidency and a national unity cabinet where FPM and its allies controlled, a huge section of the cabinet, and they could have, stopped any decision whatsoever. And they didn't stop the renewal of Salameh. Obviously, there was some political back and forth, but it didn't qualify to actually replacing Salameh by another guy, although he is old and although they had criticized him in the past. When Salameh was targeted with a lot of popular anger, a lot of protests, and public shaming from Diab, basically Hassan Diab, the current PM, March 8 forces did not go ahead and use this ultimate opportunity to kind of replace him with another person, and they although they kind of, as if they leaked some intentions to media and they created this buzz around it, eventually nothing happened, and Birri clearly said, we're not getting rid of Salameh, we're keeping him there.
So they held back, at least for now.
Exactly. So it's really that he seems to be the key guy in the establishment and someone that the establishment relies on. And one former high-level official who described Salameh to me as the don of the mafia. If the establishment is a mafia, then he said Salameh would be the don, or the guy keeping them together and keeping order of business. And it might be due to what Salameh knows about, the wealth accumulated by these politicians and what they have done with it, and how they have coordinated, some financial policies and their own political gain. That he knows a lot of stuff for sure.
Absolutely,
this definitely is one of the main reasons, possible reasons for sticking to him. But I think the rudest and the clearest manifestation is when Ghazi Wazni, the current finance minister, said, the political force that backs me or I'm affiliated with rejects a forensic audit of the central bank. Why would someone ever say that? Salameh must be really close. Yeah. And I think, talking about him as separate from the political establishment in Lebanon would be a great mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think this all connects, back to something that has become taken on increasing importance since the October 17th revolution, and that is this insistence on transparency, greater transparency, and anti-corruption. That the Lebanese people are sick and tired and fed up with a bunch of politicians making deals in back rooms, and that seems to be precisely what Riad Salameh was a part of. Like I mentioned before, he wasn't, he keeps his head down, and like a good bureaucrat should. But on the other hand, we don't see this transparency on all of his decisions and on how he runs things and how he decides things. There hasn't been any of that. And that's quite troubling, especially as we learn more and more of the utter insanity that has been going on at BDL over the past 5 years or so, and maybe longer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just looking at his performance and his behavior since October 17 gives us an idea of how transparent this man is and his institution, right? Salameh was not at all transparent in terms of the numbers, the foreign exchange numbers. When we needed the most, he was just throwing numbers without substantive support for them. And he was, contradicting what a lot of experts and companies were saying, and he didn't feel the need to actually, be very transparent and very clear, because he had all of these years, he had been, praised and, talked about as this hero, a technocrat who doesn't do anything wrong. So it's not surprising that he doesn't understand this shock and this shift suddenly. But anyway, he has been, not accepting any responsibility for bad policies, right? Because Salameh is, the central bank is the entity that legitimized most of the debt that happened in Lebanon, and it's the entity that oversees banks, and it has so
did
much
all the financial engineering.
Exactly. So plenty of decisions were literally coming from or passing through Salam's office.
Yeah.
And he has to claim some responsibility. He didn't. He said, neither for the BDL losses, nor for the behavior of the banks, nor for the accumulated debts on the state. He blamed everything on the politicians and the MPs and the governments, and he didn't want to take any of that and of the blame, which is, I think, not at all either competent or responsible.
At first blush, that sounds very anti-establishment of this establishment figure.
Yeah. But this is one thing about Salameh. He can say whatever he wants, but what's important is what he does, and what he does seems to be very good to the establishment. So whatever he says. Anyway, he's been making like all of these statements like, oh, they want a haircut so dangerous, while people are actually receiving the haircut already. Middle class and poor people are already seeing the haircut on their deposits through decisions made by Salameh himself in relation to withdrawing dollars from in lira, and these decisions have also harmed, like exacerbated the problem of lira depreciation itself. First of all, people were losing some of their money, and then they were getting this money and going and buy dollars again, going back into the same cycle. So it's not that he's been slightly less transparent than he should, or that he hasn't had the best policies. He's made some bad policies. He's allowed some extreme accumulation of debt, interest rates, and public debt that doesn't make sense based on any standards. And he has made some decisions himself, like financial engineering decisions that accumulated great losses, and he doesn't want to claim any responsibility. And when the crisis happened, when uprising begins on October 17, and the banks decide to literally just impose arbitrary control measures that are not based on any law whatsoever, Riad Salameh is like, no, that's not my responsibility. That's not my jurisdiction. I can't do anything without the parliament intervening. And then suddenly, a few months through, after people had been already, devastated by the bank's decision and the arbitrary decisions of the banks, and while the banks were like just transferring tons of money for their rich friends, and the central bank knows all of this data, right? While Riad Salameh has seen all of this, his first intervention is something like, yeah, let's allow this many dollars to be withdrawn in lira under a rate that doesn't make any sense. It's neither the market rate nor the official rate. And the interventions that he actually did were too late and were not the right ones. So, like, this guy has not a mixed legacy. He has been, he has been his management style and his actual decisions and the content of them have been very controversial, and it's really fascinating that he's still in his position today, in my opinion.
Yeah, and speaking very quickly just on that responsibility, him taking responsibility, well, there were certain things that he was responsible for very clearly. The way that banks actually operate, he is ultimately responsible for a very large part of that. And has he been on depositors' sides, forcing the banks to live up to their legal obligations? Absolutely not. He's just stepped back, been very quiet while banks have imposed all of these insane illegal restrictions. And basically he has abdicated his role, it seems, in many ways, of just watching over the financial sector, keeping it in check, ensuring that it continues. Because right now, Lebanon doesn't have a real financial sector. Mm-hmm. It does not exist. Try to take a check to a bank and see if you can actually cash it. You cannot. You cannot. At least it's a process that takes several days usually. There is no financial sector to speak of anymore in Lebanon, but Riad Salameh still is, not taking any sort of responsibility for that.
Yeah, and it just it's in general, I think, to wrap up, it's clear that this guy is not like one bad apple. This guy has a big role in maintaining because we're talking about maintaining the capacity of political authorities throughout these decades to survive, to overcome crisis. When he did the financial engineering, one of the times he did financial engineering procedures, it was when Hariri was quote unquote allegedly forced to resign by Mohammed bin Salman. This is how supposedly he was able to save the state by swapping, doing the swaps, but this was at the cost of accumulating debts and losses. And at many times when we look at how, for example, he's been credited for handling, as we said, the financial aid, the 2008 financial crisis and protecting the lira. But then when we see how he did it, was through giving very high interest rates, partially through giving very high interest rates on lira accounts. So people would bring in their dollars and switch them to lira for high interest rates. And this is why and these interest rates have turned into what? They've turned into public debt. Eventually, that has to be paid from public money. So Salameh is not someone who
to a massive
has been...
hole in BDL's balance sheet. Yeah,
exactly. And so Salameh, to say that Salameh, for example, is someone who has been watching from outside, watching the corruption and allowing it, is a real understatement, and it's not fair at all. Salameh has been, a major part and parcel of this establishment, and without him or someone playing his role, it's not like specifically related to him or his personality, but without someone playing this role, the Lebanese establishment wouldn't have been able to continue this far with, the bad economic and financial indicators that we've had in the last decade or so.
Yeah, I think it's totally unfair to place all the blame on him. Sometimes it seemed a few weeks ago that there was this big debate over like, well, should Riad Salameh go or should Hassan Diab go? Like, who's worse? Who's the real problem? And it's kind of like, no, the problem is more complicated than that. And all of these people, especially the ones who've been around for a really long time, do have some responsibility in all of this. Obviously, Riad Salameh does carry a lot of that responsibility because of his position, for how long he's been there, all of this stuff. But it's not one of these things where he alone.
Yeah, I think protesters are sometimes the most eloquent in describing and expressing these things. كلهم يعني كلهم سلامة واحد منهم. Just simple, straight to the point, right? This is it. He's one of them. He's part and parcel. He has great connections with most of them. They bring him again and again to this position. He could have retired, he must have something in this.
Oh, he must be kicking himself now.
Yeah, I think so too. He's probably never going to be president again. Bad news on his birthday, but no, it's not going to happen. So overall, this was Riad Salameh. Hope this profile was kind of, told you some new things because we don't hear a lot of stories about this person himself and his background. But he's definitely one of the most interesting figures, I think, in post-war Lebanon, and the role that he's played and the combination of, the profile of the technocrat and the skilled person, and also being someone who is deeply rooted in the political establishment.
Yeah, very political. Yeah,
it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's all the time we have for this week. But thanks so much for tuning in. We will try to be back next week with another episode. Until then, I'm Benjamin Riad.
I'm Nizar Hassan.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Riad, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.